Good morning, brothers, and I'd like to thank you for listening to Church of God Music and Educational Internet Radio and Hope of Israel Worldwide Internet Radio. We're going to be talking today a little bit about spring holidays and in particular the Christian Passover. Give a little summary about it. But before we get into that, we're going to listen to a nice, beautiful, lovely, spiritual song. And I shall return in a few minutes, so stay tuned for that. All right, brethren, I want to thank you for listening to that lovely song. Music plays such an important part when discussing spiritual things. That was a lovely piano piece. And welcome back. And I wanted to discuss about the Christian Passover a little bit. The 2026 spring holidays, the Passover day is April 1st, which is observed on the previous evening, March 31st. About 7:30, it should be the ceremony. And the first day of unleavened bread is April the 2nd. Last day of unleavened bread is April the 8th. But And all this agrees with the truth of God. Therefore, since God has preserved his truth and his word, we can find and understand the truth of God. And the first question I want to ask, was Jesus' last meal really the Passover? Was it the Passover that Jesus ate on the eve of his crucifixion? Or was it only a pre-Passover meal? Now, Jesus himself gives us the answer as recorded in the Gospel of Mark. And we will see that there is no question whatsoever that Jesus kept the Passover. So let's begin in Mark 14, verse 12. And on the first day of the Unleaveneds, this is a literal translation from the Greek. We know the New Testament was written in Greek. As we learned in chapter 17, the first day of the Unleaveneds is designated that first day of the year requiring unleavened houses and unleavened bread. That was also the day when the Passover lamb was killed, as commanded by God in Exodus 12. So let's continue in verse 12. When the Passover they killed, this expression is most revealing because of the intrinsic meaning of the Greek verb. The English word translated they killed comes from the Greek verb ethion. The verb root is thuo. The verb ethion reflects the following case and action. Third person plural, they, imperfect meaning and action not yet completed, but taking place at that very moment, were killing. Active, indicative, being done personally at that moment by the subject. They. A literal translation of the Greek would be as follows. And on the first day of the Unleaveneds, the Passover was an unleavened day, when they were killing the Passover. The original Greek text shows that the lambs were being killed at that very moment as Jesus sent his disciples into the city of Jerusalem. These lambs were not being killed by the priest at the temple. That would follow the next afternoon. For the 14th, 15th temple killed Passover. Who were they? The word they in this verse can only refer to those who were killing the Passover lambs at that moment on the 14th. They could not possibly be referring to the priest at the temple, because the temple sacrificed Passover lambs were not slain until the next afternoon. The only logical conclusion is that they refers to those who were killing the Passover lambs at houses or inns where the domestic Passover of the 14th would be kept. The lambs were being killed at the beginning of the 14th, according to the statutes and ordinances of Exodus 12. This was the exact moment that Jesus sent his disciples into Jerusalem when they were killing the Passover. Properly translated, brethren, this verse in the Gospel of Mark has profound meaning. When Mark's account is combined with Luke's account, the impact is even greater. Now here are Mark 14:12 and Luke 22:7 combined in a literal translation. On the first day of the Unleaveneds, in which it was obligatory for the Passover to be killed. When they were killing the Passover, his disciples asked him, "Where do you desire that we should go and prepare the Passover that you may eat?" What a powerful story these verses are telling us. There can be no doubt whatsoever as to the time of day these verses are specifying. Apparently, brethren, Jesus had not previously instructed his disciples to make arrangements for the Passover. They knew that it would soon be time to eat the Passover, but they did not know where Jesus wanted them to make the necessary preparations. Since the killing of the domestic Passover lambs was happening before their very eyes, the disciples asked this urgent question, as the combined verses of Mark 14:12 and Luke 22:7 convey. On the first day of the Unleaveneds, in which it was obligatory for the Passover to be killed, when they were killing the Passover, his disciples asked him, "Where do you desire that we should go prepare the Passover that you may eat?" Now consider for a moment, brethren, if you were one of the disciples and could see the domestic Passover lambs being killed at that very moment, and you knew that the Passover was at hand, don't you think that you would ask the same question? Of course you would. The narrations given in the gospel accounts clearly show that the domestic Passover was a common practice. It is also apparent in these accounts that the disciples were accustomed to keeping the domestic Passover, as indicated by their question, "Where do you desire that we should go and prepare the Passover that you may eat?" And so it shouldn't surprise us to learn that the domestic Passover was common at that time. Remember, brethren, the temple could not possibly accommodate the vast numbers of people and lambs required for everyone to keep the Passover within the allotted time. It would have taken several days for all the lambs to be killed before the altar. The domestic Passover was not only common, but it was of necessity the predominant practice at that time. Now, when we examine all three gospel accounts, which record Jesus' instructions to his disciples, it is obvious that Jesus kept the domestic 14th Passover, and the evidence is overwhelming. Matthew's account here says, "Now on the first of the Unleaveneds," which is the Passover day, "the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, 'Where do you desire that we should prepare for you to eat the Passover?' And he said, 'Go into the city unto such a man, and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus directed them, and they prepared the Passover." You'll find that in Matthew 26:17 through 19. Now Mark's account says, "And on the first day of the Unleaveneds, when they were killing the Passover, his disciples said to him, 'Where do you desire that we go, so we should prepare that you may eat the Passover?' And he sent forth two of his disciples, saying to them, 'Go into the city, and you will meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wherever he may enter, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is the guest chamber where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. There prepare for us.' And the disciples went away and came into the city and found exactly as Jesus had said to them. And they prepared the Passover." You read that in Mark 14, verses 12 through 16. Now Luke's account says, "Then came the day of the Unleaveneds, in which it was obligatory for the Passover to be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare for us the Passover, in order that we may eat it.' But they said to him, 'Where do you desire that we should prepare?' And he said to them, 'After entering to the city, you will meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. follow him into the house where he enters. And you shall say to the master of that house, the teacher says, where is the guest chamber where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. There prepare the Passover. After departing, they found everything exactly as he had said to them. And they prepared the Passover. That's Luke chapter 22, 7 through 13. Now, what did Jesus himself say in these three gospel accounts? Well, Jesus did not tell the disciples they were going to eat a pre-Passover meal a day earlier, as some have claimed. Jesus specifically told them to prepare the Passover. It was the Passover that Jesus ate, not some other type of meal. That is what Jesus himself said. I will eat the Passover with my disciples. Jesus was not instituting a new pre-Passover meal, kept a day early. It was simply the Passover. The disciples did not know or understand that it was Jesus' last Passover, or that he would end the old covenant with that Passover, or that he would institute the new covenant Passover on that night before he was crucified. Furthermore, Jesus did not command Peter and John to go to the temple to sacrifice a Passover lamb. His command was to follow a certain man to a certain house and prepare the Passover at that house. They would eat the Passover there. Nothing could be clearer, brother. Jesus' own words to his disciples are overwhelming evidence that it was the Passover, not a pre-Passover commemorative meal or Lord's Supper. The context of these scriptures proves it was the Passover. The word Passover is used 11 times in these three accounts. Furthermore, the house is mentioned 3 times. Not once is the temple mentioned, nor is a temple-killed Passover lamb remotely indicated in these accounts. There can be no doubt that Jesus kept the domestic Passover on the 14th day of the first month as commanded in Exodus 12. So in spite of these clear, easy to understand scriptures, the advocates of a 15th Passover refuse to acknowledge Jesus' own words. In their study papers and doctrinal presentations, these direct statements of Jesus about his last Passover are either ignored or deliberately left out. But ignoring these clear scriptures cannot change the reality of what the gospel writers have recorded. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all plainly state that Jesus and the disciples did indeed eat the Passover. Jesus' last Passover was not a pre-Passover meal or a special supper. Jesus did not change the Passover day and make it a day earlier, as some advocates of a 15th Passover claim. Such speculations are not true and completely contradict Jesus Christ's clear statements as recorded in the Gospels. Jesus gave these instructions to Peter and John. And you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is the guest chamber where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. You find it in Mark 14:15. There, at that place in that house, prepare the Passover. Luke 22:11 through 12. The gospel accounts do not specify whether the disciples' preparations included the killing of the Passover lamb. It is possible that Peter and John killed the lamb themselves. However, since everything was furnished and ready, it is more likely that the master of the house had already killed the lamb by the time Peter and John arrived. In that case, they would have begun roasting the lamb and setting out the other foods for the meal, making sure that the unleavened bread and wine were ready. They completed whatever was necessary to prepare the Passover. Luke records, and after departing, they found everything exactly as he said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Luke 22:13. The length of time, brethren, required for those preparations was determined by the size of the lamb. According to God's commands, the Passover lamb was to be a year old or less. That's in Exodus 12:5. But it could not be younger than 8 days old. Leviticus 22:27. The older the lamb, the more it would weigh and the longer it would take to roast. Conversely, the smaller the lamb, the more quickly it could be roasted. When we consider the chronology of events on that Passover night, brethren, it is clear that Jesus did not have time for a long, extended Passover meal, since it was only a few hours before Jesus would be arrested. It appears most likely that the lamb for Jesus' last Passover was a very small lamb, not more than a few weeks old, and very possibly he may have been only 8 days old, the minimum age for a Passover lamb. Peter and John completed the necessary preparations, and at the proper time, Jesus and the other disciples came to eat the Passover. Since the lamb was probably very small, the Passover meal could have been ready as soon as 7:30 p.m. The subsequent events of that night indicate that the Passover meal began early and ended early, perhaps 9:30 p.m. Luke records Jesus' words as they began the Passover meal. And when the hour had come, he reclined, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said to them, with desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Talking about his crucifixion. Because I am telling you that I will not eat of it any more until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Luke 22:14 through 16. So, brethren, in summary, the New Testament clearly reveals that 1, Jesus kept the Passover, not some other meal. So, brethren, I want to thank you for listening. And I hope you have a nice Passover ceremony. And I hope you have a good first day of unleavened bread and a good last day of unleavened bread. Remember, that is to help us, to remind us that we are to continue to be removing sin out of our life. And the Passover reminds us of Jesus Christ's sacrifice for us and for the whole world so that we can be reconciled to God. So, brethren, I want to thank you for listening to the Church of God Music and Educational Internet Radio, Hope of Israel Worldwide Internet Radio. And until next time, I bid you peace.